Okay, great. Um, I'm here with Bryan Fanning, who's a professor of migration and social sociology in UCD, very highly regarded author and lecturer, and delighted to have him on to talk about all things migration, asylum, immigration, foreign policy in Ireland at the moment. But I suppose just to start things off, we better explain the genesis of this call. And is something of a controversy because um, Bryan put out a tweet about a few weeks ago in which I was labeled or mentioned as a far right candidate, and we will get up this tweet just uh, here now in 1 minute. Um, we can just take a quick look at it. Bryan, can you see it there on your side?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can. If you'll see the tweet, and I'll read it out, day after day, I field requests from international journalists who wanted to write about the rise of the far right in Ireland. And this was a thing in the run up to the general election. Day in, day out, international journalists from countries like Germany and France, where there are significant far right parties, wanted to write an article about the rise of the far right in Ireland. And my line has been that there's no demonstrable rise of the far right in Ireland, that there are some actors, that they are marginal folk, and the results of the general election certainly bore this out. So what I wrote with that was that one sentence and then sigh, and then I attached a screenshot of a list of candidates that I didn't create myself, but basically got online to illustrate this. And then when asked about it initially, as in basically immediately after posting, I made the point that some of the people on this could certainly be regarded as far right, but certainly not all. And then basically that retweet went viral. And then you got in touch with me because you felt that you had been mislabeled within this. And I basically said, yes, I'd be delighted to talk to you in relation to all matters relating to migration and indeed anything you want to say, because that seems like a reasonable thing to do. And also, in terms of my own research on this, I come from it with an argument that dialogue is important, that it's important for people not to live and exist only within silos. So a lot of people who write in support of immigrants or asylum seeker advocacy and so on mostly talk to each other. And then people who have concerns about migration and so on mostly talk to each other. So there's a value in having conversations. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to agree in all things, but conversations should be civil and should
Yeah.
be possible. And we're all the better for having such conversations. And I would go further to say that in terms of debates about immigration, I believe in the need for viewpoint diversity. In other words, people who hold different views have a right to be heard on this topic, and shutting them down doesn't make an awful lot of sense and is a bad thing to do in the longer term. So, in that spirit, here I am.
Yeah.
And certainly, I've been following you online, and I note with interest positions you have struck, things you've written about, concerns you have, your concerns about accountability in certain areas. And to some extent, some of our concerns and issues and even positions overlap a bit, but I'm certain we also disagree about some things.
Yeah, no, completely. So let's just wind back a little bit. I agree with what you said there, but let's just focus on the point, the initial point of the call, and it was really around the term far right. Okay,
Yeah,
and I was very surprised when this tweet went out. Is I would say a little bit offended, damaged me a little bit. But I also want to make clear, don't like going down the road of defamation and things like that. There was a case with a high profile Peter Casey this last week in the paper, and something similar was written about him. And there was a defamation case. And anyway, that's not the way I want to go. I wanted to talk about this. So,
but first
what,
of all, there was no defamation. Let's be clear about that.
well,
Let's be absolutely clear about that. There was
there may
defamation
have been.
in the sense that basically I make a general point about there not being a far right in Ireland, and you've chosen to read something into that.
No, no,
I
okay,
think
okay.
the point of the tweet was basically that the far right in Ireland it has done very poorly indeed,
Yeah.
and that's what essentially my point.
I'm not saying the intent was there, but from my point of view, and from the 300,000 people that read it, there was a list, far right candidate, and my name underneath. So, but 1 second, what is far right?
It's a good question. I mean, simply put, I mean, the right and the left are places where people can sit in a room. And, back at the time of the early democracy in France, people on the left held certain political views and people who sat on the other side of the room had others. So there's, if you will, a center at all times in politics. And there are people who are left of center and right of center. And then the far right, basically, as you say, is understood, generally speaking, in democratic societies to be a pejorative term that refers to people who hold extreme views that can shade into anti-democratic views. And certainly they're not views I would associate you with holding. Can I be clear about that? Although I could understand how some people who use the term way too loosely would basically group you and many, many others who I would regard as centrists, kind of, and the right, because some people would sort of say anybody who doesn't agree with them is far right. But that's a ridiculous position to hold. So what it actually means is up for grabs. There's also academic distinction between far right and radical right. And certainly, basically, there are many different sort of aspects to these definitions. They include not just holding certain kind of positions on issues such as immigration, but also basically holding certain issues about institutions and democratic institutions, one's willingness or, if you will, desire to disrupt these or undermine these, and so on and so forth. So again, the term doesn't always make sense, but nevertheless, I would use the term myself in relation to people who might be extreme nationalists, have a very, very narrow idea about who can be in Irish society or deemed to be Irish, who support certain actions that basically are often about intimidation and so on. These are not things I would associate you with. Parties sometimes, people like Justin Barrett, for example, I would consider him a radical right person, somebody who basically professes to want to undermine democracy. Some of the other parties, small parties with national in the title, hold positions on immigration, and on many other issues that basically seem to be extreme compared to the norm. That said, basically, we probably could sit down and break bread with anybody, or most folk anyway, and agree on a whole bunch of things, but that's not necessarily on politics.
And okay, so the viewpoint you're saying is the two things you've mentioned there is kind of maybe militant, anti-immigration, and maybe anti-democratic in some ways. Okay, what is far left?
Far left, I mean, can go from basically people who want to bring down capitalism and therefore the entirety of society as well. So you can have extremisms on the left as well. So, for example, state socialism, communists, Trotskyists, Marxists of various kind would sort of say that their aim is to bring down capitalism, the very, very system. And they would profess a form of politics that is mostly about disruption as well.
But just so if the far right, or if you're far right, get termed Nazis, and that's socialism. So explain.
Well, the far left of also, if you were the extreme left, in terms of communists, are also responsible for millions of deaths around the world as well. These are extreme people, and what they profess to want is something that people in democratic societies, or at least most of us, would basically not agree with.
Well, and why do
these are very extremes we're talking about?
Why do you think the term far right gets used 100 times more in Irish, but also most media, than the term far left?
I think the term far left gets used quite a lot if you look for it. So, for example, would I consider People Before Profit a far left party? Yes, I would. But I think the term does get used, but it doesn't seem to have the pejorative sense at the moment that basically is associated with the term far right.
Yes, yeah, well, that's the point I'm getting at. Like, if People Before Profit in your eyes are far left, but they've got 3 TDs in the Dáil, most of whom get elected actually in South Dublin, and they're not vilified at all. If anything, they're celebrated because they're People Before Profit.
It depends where you look. I mean, I think it depends where you look. I mean, as a political party, they get a certain percentage of support.
Where we're looking,
people have voted.
Where we're looking here is Irish Times, RT News, and general mainstream debate. That's where we're looking. We can find the answers, in different pockets online. But the point here is mainstream.
They're taken as mainstream, yes. You could say basically that Irish politics, the center of Irish politics and this what's called the center left, and then basically there are other left groups that are regarded as part of the mainstream of Irish politics, very much so. And that is a sort of a general consensus in Irish society. There's a term in politics called political science called the Overton window.
Yeah.
And that's the term basically, the positions that are deemed to be acceptable. So there's certain things you can say and not say at a given moment in time. So, for example, you can say certain things about gender or not, or about race or not, or about anything or not. Some things are acceptable at a given moment in time. Things that were acceptable 20 years ago aren't acceptable today. Generally speaking, could get you cancelled for those things, or at least you would face recriminations. So basically, you could say by the standards of the past that you could say that many left ideas and positions are part of the mainstream of Irish politics. Yet, if you look to the total number of parties who are either hard left or far left, and others like, say, Labour and Soc Dems, who overlap with them perhaps to some extent, that they're a relatively small part of the Irish electorate, but a part of it that's performed rather well in politics, say, compared to the right, more generally speaking.
And so, final question.
That's just where we are at the moment.
Yeah. Final question, just on left and right. In my view, people that had dissenting views about immigration and weren't able to package their dissenting view in a palatable way, and may have been more working class and or had different reasons for their dissenting views, were deemed far right by people higher up in society because they simply looked down at them. And if you look at the list that you put
I agree with you.
An awful lot of people on that list, like when they are not, not palatable to most people, but when you listen to their actual concerns, you realize you should start empathizing with these people, but instead they get labeled far right. Would you agree?
I agree. And what I would say about that is this: it was a protest I was on radio. It was actually BBC Northern Ireland. I was asked the difference between kind of people from the community who showed up to protest against what would be an iPass centre, a hotel turned into one, and others. I said, yes, I said they basically are saying the same thing. They're both perhaps making the same point today, but most of those people just want their questions answered and their concerns addressed. But some people who have come to that town for that day with their cameras want to burn everything down. And that's the difference. I mean, people who express their concerns are sometimes labeled far right, and that is a lazy thing, a patronizing thing, and not a helpful thing to do. At the same time, basically, there are actors out there who basically want to burn things down, who want to create conflict, and so on. So that is part of it. And these are a relatively small group of people who, even if some of them have managed, even if some of them have done kind of reasonably well in terms of local elections, it's a tiny number compared to the overall number elected as councillors, or indeed, in terms of the general election, not very well at all. So there are people who will hold basically extremist views, but most people don't hold extremist views. Many people have concerns. As you say yourself, many people feel they can't express their concerns without being labelled as racist. And that's an issue. And I think we need certainly much more nuance in terms of that. And it's certainly basically the one thing I would say if I was speaking to an audience of people who were progressives or social liberals about the issue of immigration or about a number of other issues related to the so-called culture wars is basically don't treat people you disagree with disrespect. If you want to lose people forever, disrespect them. That's the way it happens. In America, in American politics, there's a term basically for the heartlands that tended to vote Republican. It was called the flyover states. So the liberals, who tended to be elite groups in politics and media, lived on the coasts. They flew over the heartlands and just looked down on people in more ways than one. And that has worked badly. That has worked badly in many countries. So we should treat people with disrespect. We should treat people who hold more conservative views than us with respect. We should treat people who come from different communities than our own with respect. We should basically be capable of having dialogue and debate. And my argument would be that it should be possible to have dialogue and debate, even robust debate about a number of issues, especially ones that people think are important.
And so do you think just looking back at the election cycle just gone, the debate was shut down.
No, not for a second. I don't, because social media is, kind of, you go on the Irish Times and you get a certain number of people reading it. You tweet something or you post something about, say, I don't know, a protest in Newtown on Kennedy, and you get several million views. So
And
there's lots of information flowing around in
okay,
many ways. But if you're
okay,
talking about in terms of RTE, the Irish Times, maybe the answer is yes.
yeah. Well, again, we're only talking about Irish mainstream media. Obviously, we can now say what we want on X, thanks to Elon Musk, buying Twitter, and that should be celebrated. I'm not sure if many people publicly celebrate it as much as it should, but I used to post on X probably during COVID times or on Twitter, and my account was capped. And now I felt it completely, and now it's not capped, and I can, freedom of thought, freedom of ideas. But I'm purely talking again just about RTE. I would say that the debate on immigration, on crime, on more sensitive issues was completely shut down on RT debate. Like the I don't think the leaders ever had to discuss immigration in detail. They did have one show where they didn't have the leaders, but they had people from the parties, went on for an hour. But even then, the people hosting the shows, like, I've a thing that investigative journalism in Ireland is all but dead. The hosts of these shows aren't really equipped or allowed to prod and really corner politicians into the difficult questions.
Yeah, I mean, it's I find watching television very frustrating. I'm a reader. I take in information in certain ways. So when I watch a television documentary, I mean, why can't I just read the transcript of which would be about 2 pages with loads of repetition? I find basically dialogue programs on RT and other channels where mostly people are shouting over each other and just
Hmm.
kind of stating their positions as set out in manifestos. So if you read the manifestos of all the political parties, I think the problem is with complicated issues like immigration. It's not that people don't have a chance to ask each other more questions, although that would be welcome. It's also that the level of debate is very, very pedestrian indeed. In other words, these are complicated issues that aren't addressed in complicated and nuanced way, because television certainly doesn't lend itself to that, in my view. It's frustrating. It is frustrating. So when you ask somebody about their position about, say, I don't know, IPAS centres, or indeed some of the positions you've struck, that you can say something over 200 characters or on a 5-minute video, that kind of, will be a position on a certain thing, and that's fine. And that's much more than you'll ever get in television with your 30-second clip.
Hmm.
But basically, what we're often talking about are very complicated issues. So when it came to, say, for example, the program done with Katie Hannon, where those various people from the political parties were interviewed, I found it very interesting because, as somebody who studies this, I at least allowed me to get a rudimentary sense of the positions of the different political parties on a number, but certainly not all, issues related, say, to the asylum issue in the run up to the general election. Because when I read the published manifestos, it was usually just glib word salad.
Yeah.
So I'm not getting an awful lot of detail about what people are proposing to do. But I did get a sense, basically, of where people stood a little bit more from that broadcast. But I'd much rather read a 50-page... I'm the kind of guy who wants to read the 50-page detailed plan on what you're actually going to do, rather than the promise to control migration or respond to communities, because these are very, very complicated and difficult things to do. And what you put forward may or may not have some chance of working better than what is there already. But when you kind of reduce it just down to a few glib statements and a few basic paragraphs, which is what one does to strike a broad political position, you're not necessarily getting into the kind of level of technical debate about what works, wouldn't work, what's good for Ireland in the longer term, what's good for communities in the longer term, the actual difficulties that lie behind those statements and the inability of politicians perhaps to offer more detail on what they might want to see done. Those are complicated issues. And I think television does a certain good job, but beyond that, you've just got to read up on the topic and look for other sources. So, really, I'm not a huge fan of television anymore.
Yeah.
I kind of
I
don't even
don't
have
think.
my television tuned to television. So, but I
You know,
watch some programs on players.
most people have unplugged, and what people might watch a lot more YouTube on their TV now than actual terrestrial TV. But it's one thing I talk about a lot. It's that, RT, radio, telefiche, Aaron, set up in the 50s or 60s. Had it been set up today, it would be called podcasting, streaming, reels, or you blogging. The format, RT should be seen as a technology company, a technology media company. If it was up to me, they would be way more involved on YouTube. They would be producing content directly for YouTube, so that, whether it's long form podcasts, and just change, like the concept of what a late show is just stale at the moment. This idea of a live, people want, 2 hour in-depth talk with Simon Harris or Micheál Martin, a talk that's challenging, like, friendly,
Yeah.
challenging.
There are good podcasts. There are some good podcasts, and some of them are associated with the mainstream media. For example, I'm a big fan of the Irish Times Inside Politics podcast, for example, which
Yeah,
does indeed
but
put figures through their paces for 40 minutes or an hour. So those things are there and relatively easy to get. I think the problems of RT don't exercise me hugely because I don't watch an awful lot of it anymore. I like the idea of a national media as distinct from, say, a transnational ex-media for a number of reasons that I would describe as patriotic or nationalistic, in the sense that when we all watch the same television programs, when we all consume the same media, we basically had a shared sense of ourselves as Irish. And
yeah.
if this gets fragmented in globalization, that in a sense will undermine what you might call the banal nationalism of us all, the sheer day-to-day experiences that they're kind of imponderables. They're things like hearing the Angelus on the radio or eating tater crisps or basically the toy show or something. Some of these are asinine things. You might not care for all of them, but they are common talking points and at least give us a sense as a bunch of people who speak English, in ways that are perhaps not that indistinguishable from people in Britain or the United States, a sense that we are the one community. So
Yeah.
I think it has a sort of a binding purpose, but it should be inclusive of the range of people in Irish society. It should do a better job on that. But my version of it would also include bringing more new Irish people, more migrants into the picture, not necessarily having kind of twee programs about multiculturalism, but reflecting the sort of the diversity of our communities up and down the land, day in, day out. And that should be an aspect of it too. I don't believe it should be forced. I don't think it should be about the message, but I do think basically our national media should reflect the diversity of Irish society.
Well, I think they're doing that. The part they're not doing is creating content that's watchable, but I do think they're making a huge DEI effort to like, I literally watched a Nationwide. I like watching Nationwide Near to the Ground, and you just see it there, like, and whether it's natural or whatever, I think they're doing a good job of that. So let's just switch up a bit. Let's talk about the current state of not immigration, but just asylum in Ireland. Just to remind them, immigration is an umbrella term. The stuff I like to mostly talk about is the asylum, because that is a direct cost on the taxpayer, and in my opinion, there's a lot of fraudulent or behavior going on. What is your overall sense of how we are doing at the moment?
We're struggling. There's no doubt about that. Certainly what we've seen since 2022, with the Ukrainian war especially, but coming out of COVID also, is this huge surge and increase in the numbers of people seeking international protection, but also the Ukrainian war. And this was, essentially a national crisis. The demands it placed on our state and our infrastructure. And whilst I think Irish people wanted to rise to the occasion as well as possible, it has been very challenging. And it has also been very frustrating that we still have very poor state capacity. And that's a term I use quite a lot. The capacity of the state basically to solve problems, to address needs. And that often involves infrastructure of various kinds. The big problem we face in Ireland, as in a lot of countries in the global north, who take in large numbers of asylum seekers, is basically that we don't do so through infrastructure anyway. And this kind of dovetails with some of the stuff you do with finance. It's that if you go to the global south, and that's an archetype, but you'll have countries where there are refugee camps with 100,000 people in them, where they can literally build somewhere in the Jordanese desert, across the road from Syria, a few miles, where there's no water or anything, a city for 100,000 people. And in a sense, it works. They build infrastructure. In Ireland, in other European countries, we mostly give transfer payments. In other words, the state just gives money, and then that's used to source accommodation and so on. In the Irish case, that's been found wanting. Using a significant portion of our hotels, coming out of COVID, to deal with the Ukrainian crisis and also the rise of international protection applicants in the absence of other forms of infrastructure. Because understandable in an absolute emergency, but basically, and also understandable in the sense that the numbers are hugely increased over what existed, say, prior to 2022, when there were plans about kind of reforming direct provision and so on. So a crisis. But we haven't had this kind of, if you will, huge step up in infrastructure yet. There's been promises of developing kind of various kind of state-owned facilities and so on. But what we haven't really seen is that done well. It's politically challenging. I guess nobody really would want one of those on their doorstep for a number of complicated reasons. But then again, pretty much every planning application in Ireland seems to go to judicial review. Okay. So yes, what the state did was it took that out of the planning process and it tried to expedite things. But we're nowhere near kind of where we should be going in terms of state-run infrastructure. So that's certainly part of the problem. Now, the bit that basically worries me the most, or has worried me about the way in which the state has responded, is what I would call the absence of boots on the ground, or Wellingtons on the ground. Too much of what happens in the 21st century now is done via Zoom. And I can imagine a situation where people are meeting via Zoom, just like you are doing, and making decisions about the world. But when it comes to situations like Coolock, or it comes to Newtown, Mount Kennedy and so on, you don't have anybody whose job it is to take responsibility for saying to local communities, hey, we're the government, we're here to help. That was Ronald Reagan's favorite one, back in the 80s. The most scary sentence in the English language was, we're the government, we're here to help. But I think basically these things can only work if there is basically state capacity, supports for community, clear game plans, ways of engaging with communities, learning from past mistakes, doing it well, acting in good faith, bringing people along with you. And in some cases, basically, we've seen the consequence of the inability of the state to do that. In terms of basically protests, conflicts, things that get on television and so on, and on social media. So I think the state's done a bad job in terms of being able to support people in communities taking in, say, significant numbers of asylum seekers and so on. It has mostly basically run a system based on transfer payments. And my feeling is that much more needs to be done, basically for future social cohesion.
What do you think the maximum number of asylum seekers that the state can handle is in a range?
I don't know the answer to that, but we have basically, if you will, took in over 50,000 Ukrainians a year for 2 years, and significant numbers of international protection applicants as well, and somehow kind of muddled through most of that, although you would argue that huge parts of it don't work well. I would put this another way to you. We're in the 21st century where every year there'll be some form of crisis on Earth, some form of disruption, some form of chaos. You could describe it perhaps as a perma-crisis. There will be a crisis, and there will be another crisis, and there will be another crisis. So I would sort of say that we need the state capacity to be able to respond to humanitarian crises on an ongoing basis, that at a level way scaled up from what we thought we needed to do before COVID. And that we need that as a routine sort of thing. We need to be able to handle it. We need to have it in our wheelhouse. And we're not there. And basically, we can turn around and say, everybody into the sea, we'll get an Irish Navy, you can all drown crossing the Irish Sea, but we're not going to do that. That's not us. And it's not even feasible if we wanted to do it. So basically, in good faith, we're going to have to take in a certain number of refugees going forward. And we need the systems to be able to deal with it well, to make it work for hosting communities, to make it work for localities, to fold people into our society, to turn it into win-win situations. We need to do that. And one of my concerns is, or problems with, which is kind of much of the sort of anti-immigration debate, or when people express views where there's a lot of reservation about this, is that they're kind of not telling us, well, what would you do instead that isn't already being tried in some way, shape, or form? I'm not saying we've got it perfect. I'm very frustrated with an awful lot of aspects of how things are done. And I certainly agree we should have a robust debate about what we should do. But I don't think there are many easy answers to these questions. And that is the problem. Without developing the infrastructure and the capacity to respond to a significant number of refugees on an ongoing basis. But these are nevertheless tiny numbers compared to the overall scale of Irish society, and a small percentage compared to the overall number of net migrants that people have no objection to at all. And we could have a conversation about that as well. And that's a reasonable conversation to have.
That's people coming here to work on visas and things like that. That's other people like to talk about that a lot more. Not so much me, because my point is the direct cost, and I'm like, this is a more glaring problem in my eyes. Let's fix this first, and then fix, if there's still problems, we could fix the other one. That's just,
it's a problem. It's a big problem. I agree with you. It's a messy problem. It's very unsatisfactory in lots of ways.
What is your opinion on, or should we be willing to learn from what's happened in Europe, in Sweden, in Denmark, and countries like that?
I think I know where you're coming from with this. I mean, these are social democratic countries with good welfare states. And basically, and it's often the case that the countries with the good welfare states, who tend to think of themselves as progressive and on the left, are often harsher on migration, generally speaking, and on refugees, the most vulnerable kinds of migrants, than countries that are much more flat and liberal. Like if you go to some countries, maybe thinking of a cliche of the United States, not the actual America, but a cliche of it, all you need to be an American is a driving license, and off you go. Whereas in Europe, it's a kind of a complicated nexus of welfare systems, education systems, pension systems, and so on and so forth. And the argument is that migrants are a drain on these. So it's easy to basically slip an us on them as basically posit migrants as the enemy of the welfare state, as draining the welfare state, as costing lots. But here's the thing of it. Once people start working, which is pretty much immediately if they're let, they are contributors. They are net contributors. If they're younger than us, they're going to be paying our pensions. I'm much older than you, basically, but somebody's going to have to pay my pension, and someone's going to have to pay your pension. It will be the taxpayers, and some of those taxpayers will be immigrants. If you have to go to a care home, the carers will be immigrants. Many of those arrived here as asylum seekers. Many of my students at UCD, well, some of them at least, arrived here, their parents arrived as asylum seekers, and now they're members of Irish society, Irish citizens doing their bit like the rest of us to get by and contribute to the welfare of this nation. So I don't think that you can kind of just think of it simply in terms of cost. When the state takes people in and puts them into the complicated system of direct provision, prevents them from working, and essentially sets up an institutional system to accommodate them. That is much more complicated than an ordinary migrant coming through.
Just hold on. They can work after 4 months as is, so it's already like freedom to work. If after 4 months you can work, and that's a whole different thing. But if you look at any of the NGO class, any of the literature they put out in their campaigns, whether it's prisons, whether it's climate, they always refer to Sweden and Denmark as the gold standard, right? And I read these documents, in particular prison systems. They always talk about Denmark and childcare. Every single political party in their manifesto, almost all of them mention Denmark's progressive childcare system that looks after things. And I'm like, it's not the Danish a la carte menu. If you want to be like Denmark, you got to have the whole pie. And they're like, no.
Hey, what? You have the ones you want, ideally. Now, as it happens, I don't agree with the Scandinavian model at all. I wonder why we're not funding kind of people to stay at home with their kids for a few years, rather than basically forcing people out into placements. I think a lot of families would like to see more of that. That's not the Danish model. You don't get to hear that much about it. When it comes to prisons, I myself, I'm pretty on the right in terms of law and order. I'd like to lock some people up, especially people who commit certain crimes of violence against us, for a lot longer. That would get my vote. So, in a sense, but there are certain aspects of the Swedish system I do like, but there are certain aspects of it I don't like. But there are some people, yes, who hold up the Scandies as having this ideal situation, but their countries are very differently structured than ours. They basically have a poorer model of social cohesion than ours. And everything on theirs is much, much more focused in on the idea of the state, and what the Swedes call the folkhemmet, the people's state. It's almost like a national socialism. It's not Nazi, it's a nationalist socialism. That's how they think of themselves as being Swedish. We think of ourselves as being Irish in a much more diffuse way that involves parishes, GAA clubs, community stuffs, churches, voluntary organizations. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we do here that is very unscandy. So basically, I'm not terribly sure that outside of a certain group of people idolizing maybe a version of Sweden they've never even visited, that it's very compatible with the Irish case. But what we are seeing is some convergence across Europe, including with Scandi, on certain things such as childcare policies, because both parents are going out to work full time, the need to have comprehensive pension systems, the improvement of social security coverage, and so on and so forth. That those things, the access to free access to healthcare at the point of use, is something that we're trying to extend here bit by bit. Those are things that basically people would support, but I don't know they'd buy the whole package.
But and then something you said that, people, society's getting older, so we've more pensions to pay and older people to look after. So you need to bring in younger people, and to me, that just seems like a Ponzi scheme. It's like we need to bring in younger people awesome. To pay for the older people, and then they're going to get older, so it becomes like it just becomes a Ponzi scheme until it collapses. But the solution to that is you need to your Ponzi scheme or your scheme needs to be self-fulfilling. So Irish people or people that live in Ireland should be having bigger families and be allowed to have bigger families. And
what are you going to do? Are you going to have the police go around and say to them, "You've only got 2 kids, you've got to have a third one"?
No. But let me finish the point, because at the moment I have one child. We would like to have more children, but financially it's going to be very difficult for us because childcare. And I'm not saying we were going to have 6 or 7 children, but we'd like to have 2 or 3 anyway. But it's what I would like to see is the government acknowledge if it is that we need more people to come to Ireland to pay for pensions. Why not acknowledge the problem and say that we're going to make it easier for younger people to have families. And I
agree with you. Yeah,
I trace this back to the budget of 2000 and when they introduced the concept of tax individualization.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next year, I think the whole concept of childcare just started to take off because the need for childcare just completely expanded.
I mean, what happened there? I mean, with tax individualization, I mean, we moved from a situation where historically, you had a male breadwinner model. A man went out to work, earned a salary, but his salary could afford to buy a home that could keep an entire family. Now, some families were poor, certainly, but basically the idea was with a single salary, you could actually manage a household. As soon as both people went out to work, it took 2 salaries just to put a roof over people's heads, and that's getting harder and harder. So we've certainly moved in that direction. And because it's financially harder, people are deferring having children. They're weighing up their options and saying, will I put off having children until I'm in a position when I can afford to do so? But that's looking longer and harder, pushing things out to the future. And that's one of the main reasons, I'm guessing, why people have smaller families or later families. Because basically they can read the sort of signs and the opportunities that are there and the risks that are there ahead of them. And the state isn't doing much to help with that. I think we're a couple of years out from a serious debate on what you might call a left-wing pronatalism. In other words, basically where the left, if they had any sense at all, would get behind the idea of supporting people to have children and families. Populations are getting older, but also in most countries in the world, outside of certain parts of the world, the replacement rate has now shifted. In other words, basically, we're moving in a certain demographic direction. You've got countries like Japan, got very old populations, South Korea, where the birth rates collapsed, Italy, where it's collapsed for a long time, many other European countries now below the replacement rate, us kind of getting there, and so on and so forth. So these are real issues. We should be valuing children more. We should be valuing families more. That would be my personal political position. And the model of just doing so through state provided or private sector accommodate childcare schemes that force both parents out to work that are incredibly expensive, or even ones that are subsidized, will work for some people and certainly meet some people's needs. But there should be much more choice for families around that. It should be easier, frankly, to have a family, and that should be something we're aspiring to. But that's not at the front of many people's lists of political demands yet. But I think it will get there. But that's one I'd certainly agree with lots of folks on.
Well, it's something, it was forefront of everything I said, and any people I talk to, Irish families, putting them first in many ways, and so many
Now,
people.
that's putting Irish families first. That's different than putting families first.
Well, sorry, but when we say the word Irish, people that are here on the island now, let's put
Yeah.
these people first ahead of people that are coming next year. Like that. That's what I mean by Irish families
Okay,
first.
so let's just take a step back then. So, there was a certain amount of debate about immigration in this election, and it was kind of a narrow debate. It was mostly focused on the asylum seeker crisis, and it wasn't a very deep or profound debate, frankly. Uh, and you could argue there should be wider debates about levels of immigration. You see them in Canada now, and in many other countries, UK at the moment, where the bigger question is, well, okay, how many immigrants should we be having? What's the plan? In the wider sense, if we're going to bring in 200,000 people a year or 100,000 people a year, how many of them could be made up of people who seeking international protection as distinct from others? Should we just be bringing in people who are highly skilled? Should we be bringing in builders? There's an argument for having those strategic conversations, and there's nothing stopping us having those conversations. A conversation as to what we need as a country. And then basically sticking with that. That's fine. That's doable if that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
But in essence, what seems to have happened in a number of countries since COVID is that there have been surges of migration in ways that people didn't quite anticipate. And I think people in Canada, in Ireland, and elsewhere, there's a sense of being caught on the back foot with this and not knowing quite what sense to make of it. And to some extent, immigration has become politicized. So the Tories did Brexit, to take back control. But they then presided over the highest levels of immigration ever into the United Kingdom. So it's a complicated issue. And you can get parties putting these fictive policies out, we'll take back control. But, there's an argument for also saying, well, okay, rationally speaking, what do we actually need in terms of people? Where do we like to go with this? What are the parameters of the debate here? Should we be including people with international protection as part of our plan? How are we going to manage that? Should we be including other categories? Do we need more doctors, nurses, and so on and so forth? Do we bring in people on temporary visas rather than permanently? As some countries are doing for certain types of work. How would that work? So kind of there is scope to have all these conversations, and my feeling is we're going to get more and more of them. And that's fine and useful and helpful, and we'll be following other countries and having those. But at the end of the day, we will still have significant numbers of immigrants coming in. And therefore, basically, we also have to think about an Irish society, an inclusive Irish society that, as you put it a minute ago, looks after the people who are here, who are committed, who are contributing, and how to make that work for all of us. Yeah. But all communities are bounded communities. All communities have their boundaries, So yes, we have immigration, but we also have borders. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Like I agree with everything you said there. And how do we get it under control? Again, it would seem that some of the likes of Denmark were able to get it on their asylum process under control by raising the bar more higher than everyone other countries of what it means to seek asylum in that country, and putting more requirements on people, seen as harsh, but it's just a responsible thing to do. At the moment, like I never talk about deportations, right? It's like too complicated, very harsh, unless they're criminals or whatever. But my thing is like, well, if we've just taken in a record level over the last 2 years, surely we're not fit to take in record levels again for the next 5 years. And it's the trend that really worries me. And for people that are scared of the far right, how this originated, if you want to create a far right, then all you have to do is get your immigration policy badly wrong. And that's the most dangerous thing you can do. And that's what's happening in Germany at the moment. They've opened their floodgates, and now you see the rise of AfD. And this is the rise of Marie Le Pen looks set to get in next year in France, because they've got
more complicated. The reason of AfD have done well, there are a number of factors, but yeah, 1 million Syrians or 800,000 Syrians back in 2015 were probably a driver of it in a sense.
Like, come on,
France as well.
One driver of it. As I think Germany have done a lot wrong. They've shut down nuclear. They've got their energy wrong. The degrowth has taken over. But like in a world that is shifting, from if we look around, Trump is in the White House. He's got Elon and that is impressive team behind him who are all about efficiency, industry, innovation. And then we look around Europe. Europe is everyone's taking a step that way, but in Ireland, we seem gridlocked of who can be more left, who can be seen to be more left. Like during the election, I was looking at an RT show as the votes were coming in, and it was Fianna Fáil spokesperson and Jennifer McNeil from Fine Gael, and they were both trying to outdo each other to how Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil were centre left. Like I was like, why are they doing this?
Here's my position on some of this. I did an analysis for a book that came out during lockdown, therefore didn't find the audience I hoped it would get, called Diverse Republic. And it was about all these issues relating to migrants, how we're going to cope, and also the politics of it. So I did it slightly before, if you will, what played out over the last few years. But one of the points I made in the book, and I've made it subsequently in other places, is that Irish political parties after the two referenda of 2015 and 2018 could see younger people turning out to vote and presume these younger people were progressive. So you had the Soc Dems, Labour Party, and also Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael especially, and Sinn Féin, all chasing younger progressive voters. And then systematically ignoring about 30% of the voters, the people who didn't vote for repeal and so on. So when Bertie Ahern was Taoiseach, for all his flaws, he was a very adept politician. And when Ash Wednesday rolled round, he wore his ashes on his forehead on RT and made damn sure people saw that. He showed respect to people. Whether he was a committed Catholic or not, he was certainly showing respect. My feeling is that most people in most political parties now wouldn't even know where to begin to talk to somebody who went to Mass or lived down the country. That there is this sort of sense that basically that appealing to a certain kind of audience and there's a certain kind of debate that has left some folk behind. Now, my concern or question was, given that there was about 20-30% of the voters who potentially not a single mainstream political party, except for Aontú, and they're a small party, were interested in, what would happen to those voters? And what would happen to them, especially if they felt disrespected? What we saw were various far-right groups make fairly pathetic efforts to get elected. And we didn't get a breakthrough of the far-right in Irish politics in the last few elections. And there's a number of reasons for that, but one of them is the multi-seat constituency. If you've got a 5-seater and you get a Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or a Shinner and maybe somebody else, or even 2 Fianna Fáils or 2 Sinn Féin, you've got 1 seat left, and that will be a rural independent or an independent candidate who will be capable of expressing dissent. So but they will not be single issue candidates. So somebody, for example, a rural independent who expresses dissent, maybe on asylum, maybe on a number of Dublin-centric issues, they're not a single issue candidate. They're not standing on a platform against immigration like the far-right candidates did. They're standing on, we want to see a solution around refugees in our neighborhood or whatever, but we also want to see potholes fixed, schools sorted, and a whole bunch of other things done. They're not single issue candidates, but they make it but because they can address some of the dissent in their communities, they make it impossible for a single issue anti-immigrant candidate to do well, for the most part. So we have seen a lot of independents who essentially have been able to address some of the discontent in the country. But what they tend to be people who reflect on a number of issues. They're not single issue people, whereas the far right guys tend to be single issue people.
Yeah.
That might be a useful kind of rule of thumb distinction to make. But we have then a smaller group of voters, maybe 15 or 20%, who the Soc Dems, Labour, and others are going after. So in other words, it's almost as if basically too many parties are focused on those voters, and not enough parties have been listening to other voters. But we saw a correction of sort in March with the referendum, when pretty much the voters of all the political parties disagreed with their party kind of positions on the March referenda. Yeah. And then what you saw was a reset take place, a minor reset that actually, seemed to be working for Harris and so on, where you basically saw them basically disassociating themselves with this kind of too progressive line. And funnily enough, even though the referendum was about gender identity and the word woman in the Constitution and so on, the actual shift in politics then was about migration. It was basically politicians being more willing to talk about migration than they had been to hitherto, and that worked in the sense that it bleeded off some of the discontent, I think. So migration moved onto the agenda, but it didn't turn out at the end of the day to be the preoccupation of most Irish people. And most Irish people hold relatively complicated and nuanced views about how things work and don't work in this country, that they're not going to blame it all on immigrants. And they certainly weren't doing that.
Yeah, well, a few things, but first of all, I don't think I think it was going to be a bit too ambitious for this election to be a breakthrough election on just that issue, because a lot of these centres that are being built around the country are not filled yet. You know, there's some major ones in Clonmel and Thornton Hall and places like that in Athlone. So they're not filled. It hasn't happened yet. My concern is the trend, and the trend is only going one way. But let's just shift tack a little bit. We have 10 minutes left. Obviously, some huge news this week or just yesterday about Israel pulling out of Ireland. What do you think resulted in this? Do you think that Fine Gael, the government, Fianna Fáil, have tried to appease the opposition parties too much and suck up those votes, and have now led us down this geopolitically difficult period?
Okay, I've thought about this like a lot of Irish people. And I want to declare some background of this. For many years, I was a member of the Holocaust Education Trust, which was an organisation set up in Ireland to encourage Holocaust awareness education, including educating teachers, organising visits to Holocaust sites, and so on and so forth. So, and the Holocaust Education Trust included, I was an academic on that trust. Others were business people and other forms of leaders, but many, of course, were members of the Jewish community. And within the Jewish community, there were a range of views on basically the Palestine question and so on, because Israelis, like the rest of us, have complicated views. My concern is the thing of it is we're in Ireland. What we do in Ireland ultimately can't hugely affect what happens in Gaza or Israel. And much of what we hear in Irish media, and certainly is very much aimed at Irish audiences. So, in other words, basically, when Irish politicians are speaking to the world, they're speaking to voters. And the fact that all the mainstream political parties have been sort of, if you will, struck this kind of very critical line on what Israel has been doing in Gaza, especially. They did so because basically they believed there was a widespread support for that point of view. And there certainly is. So in other words, basically what they're doing is that it's not just they're placating a few left-wing groups. They're actually basically, I don't think any of the political parties wanted to be kind of cut out on this issue. So maybe they were competing with one another with the vehemence of their criticism of Israel to some extent, although I do believe that for many of our political leaders, especially ones who have traveled to Gaza, that their concerns are legitimate concerns and deeply felt concerns and morally held concerns. Israel warrants criticism. That said, as somebody who in their research has been focused on topics such as racism, and I put something up on Twitter yesterday. I put up a screenshot of the first page of a book chapter I wrote back in 2002 called Ireland and the Holocaust. And this was basically historical analysis of how Ireland responded to the Holocaust Jewish people before, during, and after the Holocaust. So anti-Semitism is part of our history. And I dislike the amount of anti-Semitism I see day in, day out on X and elsewhere. In other words, where people who profess to be good people, striking moral positions in solidarity, with people who are experiencing horrendous violence in Gaza, are themselves basically kind of just being very, very intolerant of, say, Ireland's small Jewish community and what it has to say and so on. So some of this is kind of really, really kind of unedifying, is the nicest thing you could say about it. And this has been a problem on the left, especially in the Labour Party for a number of years, especially in the Corbyn years. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, basically the Venn diagram overlapped way too much. You can be opposed to some of the policies of the Israeli government, but if you believe, say, that in the destruction of the Jewish state, or you turn this into basically the hatred of Jewish people, then that's anti-Semitism. and there's a line you should not cross, because that's a problematic thing to do. So my personal view, and I can't imagine it's shared by everybody who would listen to this, is that, you know, we're a small country, and yes, we can make positive contributions in very small ways. But basically, let's be quite clear about this. When we're talking about the Israeli question, this is really a conversation with ourselves. It's Irish people kind of trying to impress other Irish people, or strike poses with other Irish people. So in other words, if there's a sort of, that doesn't mean that I'm not critical of or don't condemn what Israel has done. But I don't think, for example, the term genocide applies to what's happening in Gaza. I think call it crimes against humanity and save genocide for when there is the systematic effort to murder entire peoples. What is happening in Gaza is terrible. It is murderous. It is horrendous. It should not be condoned. It should be criticized. We should be working at ways to try and stop this, and especially look after vulnerable people. But really, kind of beyond a certain point, we should have the humility to sort of say, well, listen, we can't really solve this. So basically, why are we getting ourselves into such kind of a heated debates about this when there are so many other things that we could equally get into heated debates about? For example, in Assad's Syria, kind of, over 500,000 kind of Arabic Muslim people were murdered.
Yeah.
So it goes. So there are huge problems, and I think if you want to empathize with people like that, we do it through our refugee policies. We do it through being open to vulnerable people. We do it through our humanitarian relief. We do it through our diplomacy. And yes, I would be concerned about the Israeli embassy shutting down, because I think diplomacy, talking, that's how we get there. And in any case, basically, the idea that Irish people would be critical of the Irish government on this, the Irish government's position is a very strong position. I believe that for many of the people leading the country, such as the Taoiseach, that these are sincerely held views. I believe they command considerable support amongst Irish people. But my personal concern is that there's too much slave anti-Semitism on Irish X at the moment, and I wish people would tone it down.
When you couple that with Trump back in the White House and the woeful views that our current government have of Trump, and the close relationships between America and Israel, what should we be doubling down on trying to on diplomatic ties with America right now, but has the likes of Simon Harris and Neil Martin in their previous criticisms of Trump snookered themselves?
I'd be less worried about that, because people, first of all, say Trump is transactional. Second of all, the Trump we get, we don't know yet. And a year from now, Elon Musk and the rest of them might be nowhere near American cabinet. Trump might have rotated another 30 or 40 people in to those government positions, for all we know.
I don't think that. I think
we don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. We don't know. I don't think that should actually be the absolute driver of our diplomacy. But yes, at the end of the day, it should be. I would imagine it's on people's minds, and it should be. Well, if I was the Taoiseach, I was the Taoiseach, I'd be thinking about it. But at the end of the day, I don't think that we should be running ourselves too much wondering what America thinks or what Trump thinks of us. Europe is very important at the end of the day. Yes, American companies and tax rates are important to us, but other issues will play there. Other things will happen in that space. Whether we basically get to keep our corporate revenues or not depends very much on what America will do. But America will do that one way or another. It won't necessarily be as a result of our policy on Israel.
Yeah, but
the world is a complicated place.
In order to have the generous asylum system that we have, in order to pay for it, we need these companies here. We need a very friendly tax environment with the American tech companies. Like that's a fact. The surplus that we generated over the last 2 years equated to about 8 or 9 billion, and the money we're spending, that in my view, that surplus has gone straight into increased spending in immigration and in integration, and straight.
It has not gone into integration. Integration would be giving money to communities, to facilities in communities like Roscrea, Newtown, Mount Kennedy, and elsewhere. I'm a big believer in heavily investing in integration. But you've made some points about what you call an immigration industrial complex. Is that the term you've coined?
Yeah.
There are certain people making money out of IPAS centres, and and you've drawn attention to that, and I think some of that work is actually quite useful. And the business post the other day as well, well worth reading and thinking about that, about how we're going to fund and finance these things. And yes, keeping people in asylum for prolonged periods of time, rather than encouraging them to get out there, get jobs, get working, adapt into Irish society. They're the win-win situations for all of us. When we have something like City West, which has cost many, hundreds of millions spent since it was designated as the COVID centre. We certainly need something, but it should probably be owned by the state and others owned by the state, rather than renting them at a very expensive rate year in, year out. So even if it costs some money to get these facilities going, it's probably better the state owns and runs them. It's probably better the state has dedicated facilities rather than pushing people into unsuitable buildings in small towns and communities with no plan. But we can build infrastructure, but whether this infrastructure is hugely expensive in the great scheme of things, I don't necessarily know. We spend money on lots and lots of things, and we're talking about relatively small numbers of people. And when it comes to things like the Temporary Protection Directive, huge amounts of money came with the Temporary Protection Directive to fund that, because that's a sort of a European safeguarding mechanism that kicked into gear. So yes, we need to invest in these things.
We did not get
we got so money.
We got a small amount, but we're actually a net contributor to the EU. So
That's good.
No, that's good. But the money we gave more money to the EU than we got back from this directive. And the amount that's pittance compared to how much the whole thing costs. But like that's my whole concern, is that this is an ongoing cost. And we haven't, if once the tide goes out on this economic policy, we don't have much to show for it. We've lined.
I have a view though. Because you've written about the kind of immigration industrial thing, and you focus mostly on the cost of this, and you're saying taking asylum seekers is a huge cost to the state. How would you do it differently or better?
I would.
How would you do it better? What ideas would you bring to the table in terms of a better system?
So I would be trying to lower the amount of people that are seeking asylum in Ireland in the first place, and that's why I talk about Denmark, and I would adopt Danish style approach.
That's what the government is trying to do anyway.
No, but they're not.
That's what the government is trying to do anyway.
No, they're scared of their own shadow.
You could say they took their eye off the ball.
No, but Denmark.
Would you say? Are you, for example, tearing up the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees, withdrawing from that totally?
Well,
are you for withdrawing from the European Union?
No. Just.
I mean, what are you for? I mean, these are not easy to do things. Not that we can. Yeah. What's your plan?
The conventions that were drafted in the 1950s are like embarrassingly out of date, like just wildly outdated. Before an era of private equity, before an era of low-cost airlines, social media, mobile phones, everything.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. Right. But what's happened is that the people making the most money out of this are giant hotel groups owned by international funds.
So how would you fix that?
Well, I would.
How would you fix?
Okay, if I had the pen and I could update the conventions in the morning, you would immediately put in financial safeguards to say that private equity groups, whatever the language would be, cannot touch this. This must be controlled at a government level. This cannot be privatized. Okay.
Good. So we agree on that. We agree basically that the private sector shouldn't be profiteering off of this. Good.
Yes, 100%. Now, then, like, profit has to exist if you're in emergency situations, but not the like aggressive dynasties that we're creating. Like some families in Monaghan, I don't know if you know, they operate hundreds. They're not hundred. They operate like 20 or 30 of these centers and are making hundreds of millions of euro. He's a big shot in the GA. This guy I'm thinking of, but you need to prevent that. But then you also need to prevent the numbers of coming. Like we haven't talked about this yet, but the honest view is that my honest view is that most people coming aren't actually fleeing the conditions that were envisaged back in 1950 of war, persecution, and things like that. Some are, but some are coming from are coming from England, and they're going to Belfast and getting a taxi down. And trying to weed out who the real people that need it are is harder. So you must raise the bar. And what they did in Denmark, they introduced a very controversial law called the jewelry law, and they said that if you're coming to seek asylum, you must give over all your possessions to pay for it.
I
Now,
saw that.
in
That's
in
kind of
practice, in
they
practice,
didn't do it. Yeah.
yeah, but it raised the bar. So if you're an asylum seeker and you're like, well, I won't go there, I better go to the other
Yeah,
place.
can I stop you there for a second? Because when Ireland introduced direct provision in 2000,
Yeah.
it basically was advertising the world. We're going to treat you so badly, so miserably. We're going to make your lives so bloody miserable. Don't come here. Direct provision was designed to be a deliberately punitive system to send the message, to send your jewelry message. And in essence, basically, a lot of the messaging since basically we're going to reduce what Ukrainians get and so on and so forth. We're going to direct provision at 35 quid a week. This is telling people, come here and be treated horribly. Come here and be put into situations where you're going to have a horrendous time. And my concern, basically, with all your solutionizing is that how can we do this without punching down? How can we do this and be more humane, more supportive?
Okay,
Is it just about spreading a message that come to Ireland and be treated terribly? We'll take your jewelry off you. We cut the hair off women. I mean, it's ridiculous.
No.
It's not edifying, you know.
No, but you if you're fleeing, horrendous situations, we will take you in and you can seek asylum. Asylum is for the people.
That's what's meant to be.
Yeah, but the actual people that need asylum are now competing against people that are here for economic reasons. Like there is an unlimited amount of people that would like to seek asylum in Ireland under the current system.
Well, it's more a case that they would like to have visas to come and live and work in Ireland.
Yeah, no, but
in the absence of those possibilities, some people are using the asylum process, and that's a headache. And we can do an awful lot more there, but there's only so much we can do. So, for example, where I would probably agree with you is that when it comes to, say, for example, tearing up your passport, that should be a red flag issue. Yes. And so on and so forth. Carrier liability should be taken more seriously. There are things that can be done. But as you say, when a country's borders are porous and people can come across from the UK and whatever, there's always going to be a certain number of people making use of the system who will be, when their cases are heard, to be turned down. So yeah, we need good processes to do that. We need to share data with Europe and so on and so forth and do this really well. And those things involve cooperation with our European neighbours, not putting up the drawbridge. So these are difficult situations. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a certain number of people only. And when it comes to the overall scale of immigration into Irish society, the numbers seeking international protection are relatively small. And the challenge has got to be to how to make those people into integrated people living viable lives that are not a drain on society as soon as practically possible, and to create win-win situations. We can do more with border policy up to a point, but the problem is if the thing becomes all about control, all about security, all about borders, then you get decisions about people's well-being and welfare being made by securiocrats. And that's what happened in Ireland after 2000, is they gave responsibility for asylum seekers to the Department of Justice, who were good at many things, including dealing with subversives and so on and so forth, passing laws, but they were terrible at social policy. And they presided over a system where people were treated appallingly and where people suffered incredibly and unnecessarily. And that's the legacy also that we were trying to come to terms with just about when COVID happened, when basically the Ukrainian war happened. And then we've thrown out all our good stuff out the window as well. So yes, our new system is meaner, nastier, more ill-spirited and so on. But this is doing a disservice to the communities where people are placed. If you want to place people in communities, place them in communities under terms where there are win-win situations, where you plan for success. Because at the end of the day, most of those people aren't going anywhere. They're going to stay.
I think
they're going to be part of our communities. Their kids are going to play with our kids. And we want them to do well.
Hold on.
And that has to be part.
Hold on. Their kids are going to play with our kids. But if you look at England and some of the cities there where an awful lot of people have come from the Middle East, Pakistan, different countries, and it's now, look at Bradford, Birmingham, wherever, their kids are playing with their own kids. There is no integration. Now, what's your opinion
on the Muslim thing? And I've done a lot of research on Islam in Ireland and comparatively. The first of all, basically, is that the position of Muslims in Ireland traditionally was a relatively small community of highly educated people, doctors. And that went into the 90s, into 2000. Most of those were Arabic speaking. Then after the 2000s, we get some people coming in, Muslims, as asylum seekers, some of them from poorer countries like Algeria. But unlike, say, the Netherlands, most Muslims in Ireland are actually doing fairly well. Many aspects of our constitution are much more compatible with Muslims, say, than, say, in France, where we have respect for different religions built into our constitution, rather than this very aggressive la laïté policy, which has been very anti-Muslim at times. We also don't have these bad colonial links that some countries have with Muslim countries and so on and so forth. Muslims in Ireland come from a wide range of countries and have made a huge contribution to Irish society. And there's very little evidence that any significant number of those people are segregated away from others.
Okay.
Very little evidence, because there are very few Muslim schools. There are no Muslim so-called ghettos in Ireland. There's towns of Ballyhaunis that are very diverse, but those are success stories in many ways. Just look at the GA and many other institutions there. Okay. We don't have the same sort of setup there. Now, we could conceivably have that, but a lot of that comes from marginalizing and discriminating against people as well.
Okay. We don't have any of that ... yet. You know, the trend, this is the trend, and this is what I'm trying to get
at that too. Okay. But the answer to this is basically not more cops are sending them home, but basically integrating them meaningfully into our society through ordinary, everyday stuff that happens in communities. That's how you do it.
I'm all for that, but if you bring in 10,000 or 100,000 people in one go, there's no integration. But an interesting report came out last week, or it was a news article saying that there was more radical Islam motivated attacks in Ireland in the last year than there was far right attacks. And you can go through them. There was the attack on the priest in Galway. There was last week there was a girl slit her throat in Wexford, and you can go through them. And it's like,
hang on now. Are you conflating domestic violence with terrorism? Is that what you're doing?
No, but I'm
Wexford. Is that what you're doing? Is that what you're doing? You're saying a case that is yet to become before the courts of what looks like a horrendous case of domestic violence and saying this is terrorism.
Well, 1 second. A 6-year-old girl's throat was slit. So
that's terrorism. Is that what you're saying? That this is a terrorism? This falls under your definition of terrorism?
No, I never said the word terrorism. I never
Whatever
said
it is, it's horrendous. It's a tragedy, and we should get to the bottom of it. And hopefully somebody goes to jail for it or whatever. But is it terrorism?
No, but the guy came from prison in England. You know, he had just been let out of prison in England. The facts aren't fully out there yet, but that's one example. We can talk about the two gay.
Let's just count up the numbers of more women who've been murdered year in, year out in this country, the number of rapes and so on. And let's talk about the people who never went to prison for any of this, or basically have not, that these crimes are not taken seriously, generally speaking.
Brian,
and if we're going to do that,
Brian, you're talking.
I don't know.
Brian, you're talking.
We probably agree on most of this, but.
Brian, you're talking to the guy who has "make crime illegal" as his poster slogan. I get it. There's not enough hard actions for criminals. I'm not talking about that,
isn't it?
I'm not talking about that. I can get up the news article. The news article said there was more radical attacks than there was far right motivated attacks. It comes just back to the vilification of far right. I'll send it to you.
Been looking at both, and I'm a published author in relation to both sets of phenomena, including basically where Irish mosques are in relation, mosque by mosque, in relation to all of this. And I'm not sure you have your story straight there. Whatever somebody said in it.
I'm quoting an article that came out.
Let's be concerned. Okay.
I'll send to you. We're finishing up now in a few minutes, but you know, it's good to have these chats, but I genuinely think that last point that we've talked about, there is a concern that people that is the concern. Like the Brazilian community that is here has assimilated extremely well to Ireland. I don't know how many Brazilian people are in Dublin, but everyone loves Brazilian communities, and it's about not all people from different countries can assimilate the same, and that's what people are more worried about. It's where people are.
Brazil is a huge country. Are you talking about Catholic Brazilians, Brazilian Pentecostalists? There are so many different Brazilian communities in Ireland.
But
Whether you're
either
in Galway
way,
or in Dublin, they're very, very different people from one another, and good luck to them all in their journeys through life.
the
But there
point.
are wonderful Muslim people as well. There are wonderful Algerian people. There are wonderful Moroccan people. There are wonderful English people. There are even wonderful Irish people. You're dealing at a level of broadness here. But come back to your serious point, I think, kind of if people commit crimes, they should be punished for them. Kind of, I think as somebody who probably like yourself leans into law and order a fair bit, I would like to see basically the state more proactive in punishing people for violent crimes. So on. And certainly, if somebody, and there are conversations to be had around, say, I don't know, criminal records or crimes of violence against people and things such as refugee status and so on. So there are conversations to be had around that, but we can kind of do so, I think, without basically kind of calling everybody in a certain community a terrorist or
I never said terrorist.
But there are enough. There are. These are legitimate subjects for conversation, and I see no harm in some of these being taken very seriously as subjects for conversation.
Yeah. No. Well, look. Thank you for your time.
It's been good. And look, I do like talking to people, and can I say that I read a lot of your stuff, and I wouldn't agree with you on everything, but I do like your interest in accountability. If I was kind of to say a good thing about you, that you seem to be genuinely motivated to promote better accountability, and that is something we can always use in Ireland. And the democratic process is certainly part of that. So as somebody who stood for an election, thank you for your service, because I think politics is an honourable profession. I think Irish politicians are mostly decent people. I think they're mostly doing their best and mostly acting in good faith, including the ones in government a lot of the time. So, good luck out there, and I wish you well with your endeavours.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. We'll
take care. Bye.
There. See you. Bye bye.